The drone footage says it all. A 300-pound bull elk lying torn apart in the high country, and something massive crouched over the carcass. For a few seconds, the camera caught it, until the figure looked up. Straight into the lens. The pilot thought it was interference, maybe a battery failure. But when he hiked in to recover the drone, the valley had gone silent. No elk, no birds, just the copper smell of blood hanging in the air. That's when the footsteps started. Branches breaking, moving in sync with every step he took. He wasn't supposed to be the one hunted that day. So what exactly did his drone capture in those last corrupted frames? And if something out there can pull down an elk, what chance does a man have once it notices him? Your time here matters. Choosing stillness in a busy world makes you one of us. Thanks for being here. I never imagined I'd be sharing this account, but recent events have left me with little choice. My name is Daniel Cross, and for over 3 decades, I've made my living capturing the raw beauty of Colorado's wildlife through my lens. Most people in the northern parts know me for my work documenting elk migrations, images that have graced magazine covers and earned me a modest reputation in wildlife photography circles. These days, I live alone in a cabin just outside Walden, Colorado. It's a quiet life, but it suits me. The isolation gives me the freedom to pursue my craft without interruption, especially during the autumn months when the elk are most active. My little piece of property sits at the edge of vast stretches of public land, making it perfect for what I do. I've always prided myself on being methodical, perhaps even boring in my approach. Every shot is planned, every movement calculated. That attention to detail is what's kept me alive and successful in some of Colorado's most unforgiving terrain. Over the years, I've learned that patience and preparation matter more than fancy equipment or blind luck. Recently, I've incorporated drone photography into my work. It's opened up entirely new perspectives, allowing me to capture aerial footage of elk herds moving through mountain valleys without disturbing them. The technology took some getting used to. I'm from the old school of photography where you earned every shot with your boots, but I can't deny the results. The drone lets me document behaviors and patterns that would be impossible to capture from the ground. My typical day starts before dawn. I review weather reports, check my equipment, and plan my routes based on known elk movements. I've got topographical maps marked with years of observations, where the herds bed down, their preferred grazing meadows, the routes they take between them. It's not just about getting pretty pictures. It's about understanding these animals and their habits. The locals know me as something of a fixture in the area. I've worked with state wildlife officials, contributed to research projects, and given talks at the local schools about wildlife photography. When I speak about animal behavior or backcountry safety, people tend to listen. I've earned that trust by always being straight with people, never embellishing my stories or taking unnecessary risks. My home office walls are lined with my published work, shots that took days or weeks to get just right. There's one in particular, a bull elk silhouetted against a misty sunrise in North Park, that won several awards and really put me on the map. But it's not the accolades that drive me. It's the quiet moments in the field, watching and waiting, being present in these wild places that fewer and fewer people truly understand. That's who I was, and still am, a careful observer, a chronicler of the natural world. Nothing in my decades of experience could have prepared me for what I'm about to share. But before I get to that, you need to understand that I'm not given to flights of fancy. What I'm about to describe is exactly what happened, exactly as I experienced it. The autumn of 2023 started like any other season. I spent late September methodically checking my gear, cleaning drone batteries, and updating my topographical maps with the latest elk movement data from state wildlife officials. The morning air had that familiar crisp bite to it, and the aspens were just starting to turn golden, perfect conditions for what I Had planned. My preparation routine hasn't changed much over the years. Each piece of equipment gets inspected thoroughly: drone rotors, camera sensors, backup batteries, and emergency supplies. When you're heading deep into the backcountry, there's no room for equipment failure. I've seen too many photographers get themselves into trouble by rushing in unprepared. The hunting season always complicates things. While I respect the hunter's right to be out there, their presence tends to disrupt natural wildlife patterns. That's why I've mapped out several remote valleys where hunting pressure is minimal. These areas are harder to access, requiring longer hikes and careful navigation, but they're worth it for the undisturbed footage I can capture. I was at Mason's General Store, stocking up on supplies, when I first heard the whispers. Too local. Ranchers were talking about strange sounds they'd heard up in the timber near Wilson Creek. They described it as something between a wood knock and a deep vocalization, nothing like the usual bears or mountain lions they were used to hearing. "You heard anything unusual up there, Dan?" Mason asked me as he rang up my supplies. "You're out there more than most." I remember shaking my head, maybe even letting out a small laugh. "Just the usual suspects, elk, bears, and the occasional lost hunter," I replied. In my experience, most mysterious sounds have perfectly natural explanations. Bears can make all sorts of unexpected noises, and hunters moving through thick timber can create strange acoustics. "Well, just keep your eyes open," Mason said, his usual jovial tone carrying an unusual edge. "Thompson's boy came back from scouting last week, looking pretty spooked. Said something was following him through the trees, but he couldn't get a good look at it." I nodded politely, but didn't give it much thought. Every season brings new stories of mysterious encounters, usually fueled by imagination and the natural tension of being alone in the wilderness. I've learned that the real dangers in the backcountry are the mundane ones: weather changes, equipment failures, and simple accidents. Back home, I finished packing my gear and planning my routes. I identified 3 promising valleys that should give me the isolation I needed for undisturbed elk footage. The drone would let me cover more ground than ever before, and I was particularly excited about testing some new low-light capabilities during dawn and dusk movements. The first week of October brought perfect conditions. I set up my base camp in a sheltered draw that gave me good access to 3 connecting valleys. Each morning, I'd wake before dawn, check the wind direction, and plan my drone flights to minimize disturbance to the herds. My DJI Mavic 3 proved its worth immediately. On the second morning, I captured a magnificent sequence of 2 mature bulls sparring in the golden light of sunrise. The drone's quiet operation let me maintain enough distance that the elk remained completely undisturbed. Through my tablet's display, I watched their antlers clash while the rising sun painted long shadows across the frost-covered meadow. 20 years ago, I would have needed to spend days building a blind to get this kind of footage. The familiar bugling echoed through the valleys each dawn and dusk. Through my drone's camera, I documented the careful choreography of the rut bulls gathering their harems, younger males testing boundaries, cows moving their calves through the safety of the aspens. Each flight brought me the same satisfaction I'd felt decades ago with my first published photos. There's something deeply validating about capturing these moments, knowing they'll help others understand these magnificent animals. My routine was methodical. Every evening, I'd clean the drones, sensors, and charge batteries using my solar setup. I'd log flight paths, weather conditions, and herd locations in my journal, habits formed over years of fieldwork. The mornings were getting colder, often dropping below freezing before dawn. I'd warm my hands around a cup of coffee, watching my breath form clouds in the crisp mountain air while waiting for enough light to launch safely. At 10,000 feet, the autumn air had a crystalline quality that made every sound seem closer. The aspens rustled with the slightest breeze, their remaining leaves creating a gentle percussion against the deeper silence of the mountains. These familiar sounds had been the backdrop to my work for so long that they felt like old friends. One particularly successful morning, I captured a sequence of a large herd moving through a narrow valley at first light. The drone's perspective revealed how the elk used the terrain, cows leading their calves along established game trails while the bulls maintained their positions on the periphery. This was the kind of footage that reminded me why I still did this work. Even after all these years, there were still new patterns to observe, new behaviors to document. Each evening, I'd review the day's footage in my tent, making notes for future flights and planning the next day's positions. The quality of what I was capturing confirmed that my transition to drone photography had been the right choice. I could cover more ground, get perspectives that would have been impossible from the ground, and most importantly, minimize my impact on the wildlife I was studying. I was reviewing that day's footage on my tablet, wrapped in my sleeping bag against the evening chill, when something caught my attention. The sequence had started perfectly. A group of about 30 elk grazing peacefully in a meadow bordered by dark timber. The morning light was ideal, creating just enough contrast to highlight their movements against the frost-covered grass. At first, everything seemed normal. The herd moved with that familiar, unhurried rhythm I'd documented hundreds of times before. But at exactly 7:43 in the morning, according to the drone's timestamp, something changed. The entire herd suddenly scattered, not in the coordinated way they typically move when a predator approaches, but in multiple directions, as if each animal had been startled by something different. I rewound the footage several times, studying it carefully. There was no sign of a mountain lion or bear. No wolves, which were rare but not unheard of in this area. The wind data from the drone showed only a light 5-knot breeze from the northwest. The elk's behavior didn't match any predator response I'd seen in my decades of observation. One cow in particular caught my attention. She'd been grazing at the edge of the group, closer to the tree line. Just before the scatter, her head snapped up, ears forward, staring intently at something in the timber. But the drone's camera, despite its excellent resolution, showed nothing but shadows between the trees. Probably just hunters moving through, I muttered to myself, though I knew bow season had ended the previous week and rifle season was still days away. Besides, any hunter making enough noise to spook a herd would have been visible from the drone's height. I saved the clip in a separate folder, more out of professional habit than genuine concern. In all my years of wildlife photography, I'd learned to preserve anything unusual, even if it seemed insignificant at the time. The folder was labeled simply Unusual Behavior, October 7th, and I added a few notes about the weather conditions and time of day. Looking back at my other footage from that morning, everything else appeared normal. The herd had regrouped about half a mile away and resumed their typical patterns. Bulls bugling, cows grazing, calves staying close to their mothers. Whatever had startled them hadn't had any lasting effect. I closed my tablet and tucked it into its protective case. The rational part of my mind, the part that had kept me alive and successful in the backcountry for decades, said there was probably a simple explanation. Elk can be skittish, especially during the rut when their hormones are running high. Still, something about that moment of collective panic stuck with me, like a splinter just under the skin of my thoughts. The next morning, I packed my gear methodically, double-checking the drone's spare batteries and ensuring my tablet was fully charged. The familiar weight of my backpack settled comfortably as I started hiking before dawn, using my headlamp to pick through the understory. My destination was a drainage I'd spotted on topographic maps, but rarely visited, too steep and densely forested for most hunters to bother with. After 2 hours of steady climbing, the sunrise caught the tops of the spruce and fir, but down here the forest floor remained in deep shadow. The air felt different in this drainage, still and heavy with the scent of decay from generations of fallen trees. Thick moss covered most of the granite boulders, making them treacherous to navigate. The canopy above was so dense that only occasional shafts of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. I found a relatively open spot where several fallen logs created a natural clearing. It would serve as a decent launch point for the drone, though. The heavy timber meant I'd need to gain altitude quickly to avoid the treetops. Setting up my gear, I noticed how the sound seemed muffled here, as if the moss and thick vegetation absorbed even the morning bird calls. My chosen site offered a good vantage point of the upper drainage, where the timber thinned out near tree line. That's where I expected to find elk seeking the remaining alpine grasses before winter pushed them to lower elevations. The steepness of the terrain had protected this pocket from the usual hunting pressure, making it more likely to harbor undisturbed. Herds. As I unpacked the drone and began my pre-flight checks, something about the environment kept drawing my attention. Maybe it was the unusual quiet, or the way the shadows seemed to pool deeper than they should. I'd spent countless hours in remote backcountry, but this drainage felt different, more primordial somehow. The trees here were old growth, many of their trunks wider than my arm span, their branches twisted into shapes that spoke of centuries of slow growth. I shook off the sensation and focused on my equipment. The drone's battery showed full charge, the camera gimbal moved smoothly through its range of motion, and the tablet connected without issues. The GPS signal was weak due to the canopy, but that was expected. I'd need to get above the trees to establish a better link. The morning air was cold and still, perfect flying conditions. I set up my small folding chair, positioned the tablet where I could see it clearly, and prepared for launch. The familiar whine of the rotors seemed startlingly loud in the hushed forest, echoing oddly off the moss-covered rocks and dense vegetation. As the drone lifted off, I guided it carefully through the narrow opening in the canopy, watching the screen intently as the camera revealed the landscape from above. The morning light had strengthened, enough to give me decent visibility through the drone's camera as I guided it along the drainage. The footage showed typical elk behavior at first, a small group of cows grazing in a meadow near the tree line, their breath visible in the cold air. I kept the drone at around 400 feet, high enough not to spook them, but close enough for good detail. 20 minutes into the flight, I shifted the camera's view toward a patch of darker timber where the drainage narrowed. Something had caught my eye, movement that seemed too large for an elk. The tablet screen showed a clearing where fallen trees created a natural corridor. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process the scale of what I was recording. Hunched over what was clearly an elk carcass was a figure that dwarfed anything I'd encountered in 30 years of wildlife photography. The form was massive, broader than any human frame I'd ever seen, with a back that seemed to ripple with muscle beneath what looked like dark fur. My hands trembled slightly as I tried to steady the drone, fighting to keep the camera focused. The creature was methodically tearing into the carcass, and the ease with which it pulled apart muscle and bone sent a chill through me. This wasn't the messy feeding of a bear. The movements were deliberate, almost surgical in their precision. Then it stopped. The figure's head lifted slightly, and for a moment, I feared it had somehow detected the drone despite the altitude. In those few seconds of footage, I watched as it rose from its crouched position to stand upright. The transformation was fluid, natural, terrifyingly so. Standing, it towered over the surrounding vegetation, easily 8 feet tall, possibly more. The drone's camera shook as a gust of wind hit it, and I struggled to maintain the shot. When I stabilized the view seconds later, the clearing was empty. The carcass remained, partially dismembered, but the figure had vanished into the timber with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. I checked the drone's battery level, still at 60%, but my hands were shaking too badly to continue. I initiated the return to home sequence, my eyes darting between the tablet screen and the surrounding forest. The footage was saved to the memory card, but I couldn't quite believe what I'd just recorded. Years of professional observation told me this wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything that should exist in these mountains. As the drone descended through the canopy opening, I kept replaying those few frames in my mind. The massive shoulders, the deliberate movements, the impossible speed of its disappearance. Whatever I'd captured on camera violated everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. The tablet screen showed the creature still hunched over its kill when something made it pause. My breath caught as its head began to lift, movements unnaturally smooth and controlled. Even through the drone's camera feed, I could sense a terrible intelligence in how it oriented itself. The head turned with deliberate precision until it seemed to be looking directly at my vantage point, 400 feet up. Logic told me there was no way it could detect such a small drone at that height. The props were nearly silent at that altitude, and the morning sun would have made the drone almost invisible against the bright sky. But in that moment, as I stared at my tablet screen, I knew with absolute certainty that it was aware of being watched. The creature's face remained in shadow beneath what looked like a heavy brow ridge, but I could feel the weight of its attention through the digital feed. This wasn't the random glance of an animal noticing movement. This was recognition. My hands trembled as I gripped the controller. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that no living thing could spot and track a drone at that height. Yet the figure remained motionless, its posture suggesting not confusion or startlement, but assessment. The feed flickered once, twice. Static crackled across the screen, distorting the image. I checked the battery indicator, still showing 55% charge. The signal strength bars were full. There was no reason for any interference. At this range and altitude, the static increased, breaking up the image into digital artifacts. Through the deteriorating feed, I could still make out the figure's outline, still locked in that same unnerving posture of attention. Then the screen went black. I jabbed at the tablet's controls, trying to restore the connection. The drone should have automatically initiated its return to home sequence if it lost signal. But the screen remained dark, showing no telemetry data. No battery status, nothing. My throat felt dry as I scanned the sky, trying to spot or hear the drone. The morning air was still, making the silence more pronounced. No drone buzz, no birds. Even the ambient forest sound seemed muted. I told myself it had to be a technical glitch. Drones could suffer interference from any number of sources. Electromagnetic fields, radio signals, even unusual atmospheric conditions. The alternative, that something had deliberately disrupted my feed at the exact moment it spotted the drone, was too unsettling to consider. But I couldn't shake the image of that deliberate head turn. The sense of being not just seen, but recognized. Whatever I'd been filming, it had demonstrated awareness that went beyond animal instinct. And now my drone, my eyes in the sky, had gone dark the moment that awareness had focused on it. I couldn't leave a $15,000 drone out there. After double-checking my sidearm and securing the tablet in my pack, I started the hike toward the meadow where I'd last seen the figure. The morning sun had climbed higher, but the air felt colder than it should have. Something was wrong with the soundscape. Autumn in these mountains usually meant a constant symphony, elk bugles echoing across valleys, chickadees chattering in the spruce, squirrels scolding from their perches. But as I moved deeper into the timber, the silence pressed in. No birds, no bugles. Even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb the branches overhead. About half a mile in, I caught the first whiff, a coppery tang that made my nose twitch. Having photographed predator kills before, I recognized the smell of fresh blood. But there was something else underneath it, a musky odor I couldn't place. Not bear, not lion. Something ranker, almost human, but not quite. The elk tracks told a story I didn't want to read. Instead of their usual meandering paths between grazing spots, the hoofprints showed pure panic. Deep gouges in the soil where they'd launched themselves in different directions. Some tracks overlapped chaotically, suggesting the herd had scattered without their usual coordination. When I reached the small clearing, I stopped cold. The bull elk lay sprawled on its side, and my decades of wildlife photography experience couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Mountain lions take their prey down by the throat and feed methodically. Bears tear into the belly first. But this was different. The carcass had been ripped apart with shocking force. Limbs were wrenched at unnatural angles, joints separated not by teeth but by raw strength. The spine had been broken in multiple places, as if something had twisted the animal like a wet towel. Most disturbing were the clear signs of hands, not paws, that had pulled the ribcage apart. I'd documented hundreds of predator kills over my career. I'd seen what every major carnivore in North America does to its prey. This matched none of them. This showed intelligence, efficiency, and strength that defied explanation. The ground around the carcass told an equally unsettling story. The blood spray pattern suggested the elk had been actually lifted, before being torn apart. And there, pressed deep into the blood-soaked soil, was a single footprint that made my skin crawl. Nearly 18 inches long, wider than my spread hand, with 5 distinct toes. It looked almost human, but the size and depth suggested whatever made it weighed several hundred pounds. My drone lay nearby, crumpled like a broken bird. The carbon fiber frame was twisted, the camera gimbal crushed. The damage wasn't from a fall. The components had been deliberately mangled, with precision that suggested purpose rather than random destruction. The hike back felt longer, heavier. Each step away from that clearing seemed to draw more weight into my boots. I kept my breathing steady, trying to focus on the familiar trail markers I'd noted on the way in. The morning sun had climbed higher, but the forest felt darker, as if the canopy had somehow thickened. The first branch snap came from my left, maybe 50 yards out. I stopped, listening. In these mountains, sounds carry strangely, bouncing off rock faces and through draws. But this had been close, deliberate. Not the random crack of a dead limb falling, but the sharp report of something substantial being broken. I resumed walking, faster now. Another crack, this time from my right, keeping pace. Whatever it was moved parallel to my path, staying just inside the timber's shadow. I'd tracked enough animals to know the difference between random forest sounds and intentional movement. This was coordinated, almost tactical. My hand drifted to the sidearm on my hip. The weight of the .44 Magnum offered little comfort. I'd carried it for 20 years and never once needed it. But now, with each carefully timed step from the shadows matching my own, the pistol felt absurdly inadequate. A stone clacked against another stone, the sound sharp and unnatural. Then another, further ahead, as if marking territory. In 3 decades of backcountry work, I'd never heard anything like it. Bears don't communicate this way. Mountain lions move in silence. And hunters, even the most careless ones, make human noise. They crash through brush. They cough. They adjust their gear. The pressure of being paced from both sides forced me to pick up my speed. Not running. Running would be suicide if. This was a predator, but moving with purpose. My boots found the familiar game trail that led back toward my truck, still a mile distant. Too far. Another branch snap, closer now. Maybe 30 yards. The sound had weight behind it. This wasn't a deer or elk. Even a bear would make more noise moving through the brush. This was precise, controlled. Intelligence guided each placement, each signal. The forest had gone silent again, that same unnatural quiet from before. No birds, no squirrels. Just the sound of my boots on stone and dirt, and the measured movement keeping pace in the timber. The morning breeze carried that same musky odor I'd noticed at the kill site, stronger now. More. Stone knocks echoed through the trees, a series of them, almost like a code. They seemed to be boxing me in, steering my direction. My rational mind grasped for explanations, other photographers, hunters, rangers. But deep down, I knew better. No human would move this way, with this patience, this precision. And no known predator would hurt its prey with such deliberate signals. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on steady progress while my peripheral vision strained to catch movement in the shadows. The weight of my camera gear pulled at my shoulders, and sweat ran cold down my back despite the autumn chill. Back at my cabin that evening, I set up my laptop on the kitchen table, hands still slightly unsteady as I connected the drone's memory card. The familiar whir of the card reader provided little comfort as I opened the video files. Outside, darkness had settled over the valley, and I drew the curtains tight before beginning my review. The first segment showed typical footage, the sweeping aerial shots of the meadow, elk moving in their practiced patterns. But at the 17-minute mark, where the feed had gone dark during my live viewing, fragments remained. The video corruption manifested as digital artifacts, breaking the footage into stuttering chunks between static. 3 seconds of clear footage showed the dark mass I'd glimpsed earlier. The figure hunched over the elk carcass, its broad shoulders nearly twice the width of any bear I'd documented. The movement was wrong, not the frenzied tearing of a predator, but methodical, almost surgical in its precision. The corrupted audio picked up wet sounds of flesh being separated, punctuated by what might have been low vocalizations just below the drone's microphone threshold. My finger hovered over the spacebar, fighting the urge to pause. The next segment showed massive hands, if you could call them that, gripping and pulling with devastating efficiency. The elk's body moved like a rag doll, yet the creature's movement suggested an unsettling familiarity with anatomy, knowing exactly where to tear. Then came the frame that made my throat close up. The figure's head snapped upward, and even through the pixelation, I could see the intelligence in that brief moment of eye contact with my drone's camera. No bear or mountain lion had ever acknowledged a drone that way. The head tilt suggested not just awareness, but comprehension, an understanding that it was being observed. The remaining footage dissolved into static, occasional frames showing only blur and motion before the feed cut completely. I sat there in my quiet kitchen, the laptop's glow the only light, as my mind tried to rationalize what I'd seen. The file timestamp showed 10:47 a.m., broad daylight. Whatever this was, it hadn't hidden in darkness. My hands moved automatically, creating backup copies of the file. One to my external drive, one to a cloud server, though I knew the quality was too corrupted to prove anything definitive. The most disturbing elements were in the details, the deliberate movements, the anatomical precision. That moment of recognition. I closed the laptop, unable to bring myself to watch it again. The footage would keep until morning. Right now I needed distance from those images, from that singular moment of eye contact that felt less like documenting wildlife and more like an exchange, an acknowledgement between observer and observed. That left me uncertain which was which. Standing up from the table, I realized I'd been holding my breath. The kitchen clock read 9:17 p.m. outside. A coyote's call broke the silence, and I found myself grateful for such a familiar sound. But I knew that somewhere out there, in the dark timber above my cabin, something far less familiar might be listening. The following morning, I drove to the ranger station just outside Walden. The small building sat nestled among lodgepole pines, its weathered green paint matching the Forest Service trucks parked outside. I'd known Ranger Tom Keating for years. He'd even used some of my elk photos for educational displays. Inside, the office smelled of coffee and old paperwork. Tom looked up from his desk, his ranger uniform crisp despite the early hour. "Daniel Cross," he said, gesturing to a chair. "What brings you out here?" "Need to file a report," I said, settling into the seat. Lost some drone equipment up in the high country yesterday. I pulled out my notebook where I'd written the coordinates. Tom reached for a form. Approximate value, around $3,000. I watched him note this down, his pen moving efficiently across the paper. But that's not the main reason I'm here, Tom. He glanced up, reading something in my tone. Go on. I chose my words carefully. While I was filming elk movements, I captured something unusual. The drone recorded what looked like a large creature feeding on an elk carcass. Before the feed cut out, it seemed to notice the drone. When I hiked up to recover the equipment, the carcass showed signs of. I paused, searching for the right description. Methodical dismemberment. Tom's expression remained neutral, professional. Bears and mountain lions can make quick work of a carcass, Daniel. You know that better than most. And with the scavengers that follow, coyotes, ravens, an elk can be reduced to bones in no time. I know predator kills, Tom. This was different. I pulled out my laptop. I have some footage, though most of it's corrupted. He watched the salvaged clips without comment, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. When the figure looked up at the drone, I saw his jaw tighten slightly. Image quality's pretty degraded, he said finally, leaning back. Could be a bear. Standing up. They can look massive from certain angles, especially with digital distortion. The way it moved, Tom, the precision. And that moment when it noticed the drone. He folded his hands on the desk. Listen, Daniel. You've got a solid reputation. I respect your experience. But without clear evidence, this goes down as standard wildlife activity. I'll note the drone loss and the carcass location. He paused, choosing his words. Though I'd appreciate knowing if you spot anything similar in your future filming. I recognized the careful neutrality in his voice, neither dismissing nor endorsing what I'd seen. He pulled out a second form, documenting the carcass location for their predator activity records. Keep me posted if you recover the drone, he said, handing me a carbon copy of the report. And Daniel, he met my eyes. Maybe stick to the lower elevations for a while. Weather's turning up high. I nodded, understanding the subtle warning beneath his professional concern. As I gathered my laptop, I noticed him making additional notes in a separate notebook, not the official report. But whatever thoughts he was recording, they remained private behind his carefully maintained expression of neutral authority. The next morning, Ranger Keating's Forest Service truck bounced along the rutted access road as we headed back to the site. The autumn air bit sharper than yesterday, frost coating the sagebrush in the meadows we passed. Tom hadn't said much during the drive, just occasionally confirming directions as I guided him toward the drainage. It's about half a mile up from here, I said as we parked. Through that stand of aspens, then up into the timber. Tom checked. His sidearm and radio, standard procedure for investigating predator kills. I led the way, retracing my steps from yesterday. The silence in the forest felt different now, less threatening in daylight with company, but still heavy with absence. No birds, no squirrels scolding from the branches. When we reached the carcass site, I stopped short. Someone's been here. The elk's remains were scattered more extensively than yesterday, bones pulled apart and distributed across a wider area. The rib cage lay mostly intact, but the limbs had been separated with unsettling precision, the joints disconnected rather. Then torn. Tom crouched beside the remains, examining them with practiced eyes. Classic scavenging pattern, he said, pointing to scattered bits of hide. Bears will drag pieces away to feed in cover. Coyotes follow, then the birds clean up. Look. At the leg joints, I insisted, kneeling beside him. See how clean the separations are. No ragged tears or crushing. It's like they were. I hesitated before saying it. Deliberately disarticulated. Animals can be surprisingly precise feeders, Tom replied, but I noticed him studying the bones. More closely, mountain lions especially. I've photographed hundreds of lion kills, They don't do this. I picked up a leg bone, showing him the ends. No tooth marks around the joint. No claw scrapes on the bone. It's like it was pulled apart with. I searched for the right words, with leverage, tool-like precision. Tom's professional skepticism wavered slightly. He ran his fingers along the clean break of a joint, frowning. Could be. He started then. Shook his head. No, has to be natural predation. Maybe multiple predators working the carcass differently. But his voice had lost some of its certainty. He stood, scanning the surrounding timber with newly alert eyes. I followed his gaze to the shadows between the trees, the heavy canopy above that had hidden whatever I'd filmed. Let's document the site and head back, he said, pulling out his camera. Weather's supposed to turn later. His tone remained official, but the brisk efficiency of his movements betrayed a growing unease. He photographed the remains quickly, marking the GPS coordinates with less of his usual methodical attention, as he worked. I noticed him glancing more frequently at the tree line. His hand drifted to his sidearm once when a branch cracked in the distance, probably just ice melt in the warming day, but neither of us seemed entirely convinced. All right, he said finally, tucking his notebook away. I've got what I need for the report. We should go before the clouds move in. The walk back was quieter than our hike in, both of us more attuned to the forest silence. Tom's earlier dismissive certainty had shifted to something more guarded, though he maintained his professional composure. Whatever he'd seen in those clean separated joints had cracked his rational explanations, even if he wouldn't admit it openly. After Tom left, I tried to maintain my normal routines, but something had shifted in the valley. The familiar trails and meadows I'd photographed for decades felt different now, watched. It started subtly, easy to dismiss at first. 3 days after our visit to the carcass site, I took my ATV up to check my usual photography blinds. The morning was crisp, frost crackling under the tires as I followed the old logging road. About 2 miles in, I found a massive Douglas fir trunk lying across the trail. This wasn't storm damage. The log had been deliberately dragged there, leaving deep furrows in the earth. The positioning was too precise to be natural, angled perfectly to block access. I sat there idling, studying the scene. In 20 years of working these mountains, I'd never seen anything like it. Bears don't arrange barriers. Mountain lions don't block paths. It took me nearly an hour to winch the log aside enough to pass, and the whole time, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed from the timber. That evening, as dusk settled over the valley, I heard it for the first time, rhythmic knocking. From the ridgeline above my cabin. 3 sharp cracks, then silence. A pause of exactly 30 seconds, then 3 more. The precision made my skin crawl. This wasn't random branch movement or woodpeckers. The tempo was too measured, too deliberate. I found myself staying closer to the cabin, keeping my photography sessions shorter. The drone remained locked in my gear closet. I couldn't bring myself to launch it again, not after what happened last time, but even home didn't feel entirely secure anymore. 2 nights ago, I was editing photos when rocks began clattering against my metal roof. Not hail, distinct impacts, spaced seconds apart, like someone was methodically throwing them. I killed the lights and waited in darkness, listening to the impacts move from one end of the cabin to the other. Whatever was out there knew exactly where I was, knew my habits and patterns. The harassment felt calculated, just forceful enough to unsettle without crossing into outright aggression. A warning, perhaps, or a message I wasn't equipped to understand. My rational mind kept searching for explanations. Teenagers playing pranks, other photographers trying to drive me out, hunters marking territory. But none of those fit the precision, the strength, the deliberate nature of these events. Last night, I sat on my porch cleaning my camera gear when the knocking started again. This time, it came from 3 different directions, a coordinated series of impacts that couldn't possibly be one person. The sound triangulated my position, boxing me in. I retreated inside, double-checking the locks, knowing they'd be useless if whatever was out there decided to actually approach. My hands shook as I poured a drink, trying to steady my nerves. The confidence I'd built over decades in these mountains was eroding. Every shadow held new meaning. Every unexpected sound carried weight. I'd crossed some invisible line with that drone footage, trespassed beyond the boundaries of what I was meant to see. Now something was pushing back, reminding me that I was the intruder here. The knocking continues most evenings now, always just after sunset. Sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always with that same deliberate rhythm. I've started sleeping with my lights off, keeping to the back rooms, away from the windows. My curiosity about what I filmed has been replaced by a deeper, more primal understanding. I am not welcome here anymore. I've spent the last 3 days holed up in my cabin, debating whether to pack it all in. The footage sits on my hard drive like a splinter in my mind, grainy, corrupted, but undeniably real. I could write it off as a technical glitch, blame it on drone interference or a failing battery. That's what any reasonable person would do. God knows I've tried to convince myself, but in 30 years of wildlife photography, I've developed instincts you can't ignore. I've tracked elk through blizzards, documented their behaviors in every condition imaginable. I know their patterns, their responses to predators, their social dynamics. What I witnessed that day, both through the drone feed and afterward, defies everything I understand about these mountains. The silence haunts me most. Anyone who's worked in these forests knows they're never truly quiet. Even in winter, there's always something. Chickadees chattering, squirrels rustling, wind in the pines. But that day at the carcass site, the silence was absolute. Like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire valley. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, searching for any familiar sound. I've been shadowed by mountain lions before, felt their presence, noted their tracking behavior. Bears too, but this was different. The presence that paralleled me through the timber moved with purpose, with intelligence. It wasn't just following, it was escorting me out. The stone throws, the knocked logs, the coordinated knocking, these aren't random animal behaviors. They're messages. My reputation as a wildlife photographer rests on decades of careful observation and honest documentation. I've never claimed anything I couldn't prove, never embellished for effect. The thought of walking away from this project, of leaving these questions unanswered, goes against everything I've built my career on. But there's a difference between documenting natural behavior and intruding where you're not meant to be, looking. Through my old elk migration photos now, I can't help but wonder if I've been missing signs all along. Those unexplained gaps in herds moving through narrow valleys. The way bulls would sometimes freeze mid-bugle, their heads snapping toward something unseen in the timber. The strange tracks I dismissed as overlapped deer prints or weather-warped impressions. The footage could be explained away. The carcass could be attributed to natural predation. Even the knocking could be rationalized as some elaborate prank. But sitting here in my darkened cabin, listening to the absolute stillness outside, I know better. Whatever I filmed that day, whatever has been watching me since, it's made one thing clear. There are still mysteries in these mountains that don't want to be solved. My cameras sit unused on their charging stations. The drone remains in its case. Every instinct honed through years in the wilderness is screaming at me to pack up and leave this valley behind. But the questions gnaw at me, keeping me awake at night. What exactly did I capture in those corrupted frames? Why did it choose to reveal itself then? And most troubling of all, how long has it been watching me watch the elk? After 3 sleepless nights, I've made my decision. The drone stays grounded, at least in that particular drainage. There's something deeply unsettling about reviewing those corrupted frames, seeing that massive figure tilt its head toward my camera with such deliberate awareness. I've released some of the standard elk footage to my usual wildlife channels. carefully edited to exclude anything controversial. But the rest stays locked away on my hard drive, a digital reminder of boundaries crossed. I keep thinking about what Ranger Keating said during our follow-up visit. His practiced skepticism, giving way to that subtle unease as we examined the carcass. He's worked these mountains for 20 years, seen every kind of predator kill imaginable. Yet even he couldn't fully explain the precision of those dismemberment marks, the way the bones had been systematically separated rather than torn apart by teeth and claws. The footage itself tells only part of the story. What it doesn't capture is the methodical harassment that followed, the strategic placement of obstacles, the coordinated knocking that seemed to triangulate my position, the rocks that would clatter near my cabin only on nights when I reviewed the video. These weren't random animal behaviors or coincidences. They were warnings, escalating in clarity until even I couldn't ignore them. I've spent my life documenting wildlife, learning to read the subtle languages of these mountains. Every species has its patterns, its predictable responses to intrusion or threat, but what I encountered in that valley defied categorization. It wasn't just the physical evidence, the tracks, the kills, the territorial markers. It was the palpable intelligence behind each action, the sense that I had shifted from observer to observed. The hard drive sits in my safe, now along with the original memory cards. I've been asked why I don't release everything, let others analyze the footage and draw their own conclusions. But I've seen what happens to reputations when people claim extraordinary encounters. More importantly, I've developed a deep respect for whatever maintains that careful balance in the deeper valleys, where human presence is still more intrusion than right dock to those who venture into these remote drainages, especially with modern technology that pushes beyond traditional boundaries. I offer this warning: not everything in these mountains wants to be documented. There are predators that stalk elk, and there are presences that stalk the predators. Sometimes curiosity attracts attention from things that hunt back, not for food or territory, but with purpose and intelligence that defies our comfortable categories. I leave it to others to debate what exactly I encountered. Maybe it was an apex predator we've yet to formally document. Perhaps it was a trick of perception, stress and isolation painting shadows into monsters. Or possibly, and this thought keeps me awake more than any other, there are intelligent presences in these mountains that have learned to stay just beyond the edge of our certainty. What matters isn't the label we put on it. What matters is the respect we show for those remaining wild places where our understanding falls short. Some valleys deserve their secrets. Some mysteries are warnings rather than invitations. And sometimes, the wisest response to unknown eyes in the timber is to simply turn back, leaving the questions unanswered. If this story lingered with you, subscribe. I'll return tomorrow with more.